afternoon, everybody. How are you? Hi. It's good to see you all here today. Welcome to Connecticut's Old State House. My name is Sally Whipple. I'm the Director of Education here, and we're really happy to have you here for one of our monthly lunchtime programs. We do a variety of things for our programs. Today we have a talk followed by a panel discussion, but mainly what we like to try to do is we like to mix a bunch of different things together, a little history, a little civics, some very talkative people, a great audience, and come up with something that we hope will be thought-provoking and maybe even inspiring for you. So we hope that we will enjoy today's show. We're very pleased to have with us today Diane Smith, who will be moderating our panel and introducing our guests, and I would now like to introduce Diane Smith.
Thank you, Sally. Thanks, everybody, for being here. We're glad to have you. I want to welcome you to the Old State House and to the latest edition of our lunchtime lecture series. In this series, what we have been trying to do is show how events that happened in history, in particular when this Old State House was the State House for the state, we try to show how events that happened are still reverberating in our society today. And we have also been doing a lot of work around the Civil War, in part because this is the first year of Connecticut's commemoration of the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. And as I've learned in being on a commission that's commemorating the Civil War, there are so many issues that are still reverberating today that it seems a perfect jumping off point. Today's discussion is about dissent and how it is seen by society, and it seems even timelier than ever. Right now we're seeing dissent in action with the Occupy protests that have spread from Wall Street to Hartford and many other places in between, and in how the protesters are being characterized by people on the right and people on the left. We also hear discussion among the candidates who are now seeking the presidential nomination about litmus tests for their beliefs and whether you must pass a certain litmus test in order to be electable as a presidential candidate. In the halls of government, we frequently hear the word patriot bandied about amid charges of which politicians love their country and which do not. New media has added many more places and ways to comment and dissent, often anonymously, and how does that change the tone and tenor of conversation when you can say it without having to say it to someone's face? Talk radio and some cable TV channels are now branded left or conservative. So what's appropriate in our discourse as a people? What moves the state and the country forward? As we'll see today, these were the same themes that were echoing in our state 150 years ago as our nation embarked on a civil war. We invite you to be part of the discussion today. We have a panel including Brad Davis, the very, very popular and legendary talk show host, and Martha McCoy from Everyday Democracy. They will be joining us in a panel discussion, and we really invite you to ask your questions and engage in a little civil discourse with us. But first, introduction of our main speaker. David J. Corrigan has been the curator of the Museum of Connecticut History at the State Library in Hartford since 1982. If you haven't been there, then you need to know that the three main collecting areas for the museum are Connecticut's military, industrial, and political history. Before he came to the Connecticut State Library, Dave was at Mystic Seaport and at the New Haven Colony Historical Society, so he is very much steeped in Connecticut history and politics. Please join me now in welcoming Dave Corrigan.
Thank you for that introduction, Diane. Much appreciated. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming and sharing your lunch hour with us. I need to thank Sally Whipple as the impetus behind this presentation. I gave a presentation at the State Library about a year ago on the history of the governor's portrait collection, and Sally was there, and she asked me if I'd be willing to do something on the two portraits among the governor's portrait collection that were removed from the exhibition during the Civil War. And I said, sure. I've been trying to pin all that information down for several years, and I was convinced that I had to do it when she threatened to come to the State Library and take the portraits down again and bring them back here if I didn't do the presentation. So here I am. So thank you, Sally. What I'd like to do this afternoon is to present a case study on dissent during the Civil War in Connecticut. And this involves two portraits that 150 years and 2 days ago today were removed from the walls of the Senate chamber in this building based on the resolution introduced by Orville Platt of Meriden on the 16th of October in 1861. I'll have to unpack this resolution a little bit and place it into context, but we'll get there eventually. Orville Platt decided that former governors Towsey and Seymour were unpatriotic, perhaps even treasonous, and that their portraits had to be removed as a kind of public humiliation and a show of unity with the federal government. Now, some of you may ask, what exactly were these portraits? Well, in 1855, the state approved a resolution authorizing the comptroller to purchase 55 portraits of former Connecticut governors that were painted by the Hartford artist George F. Wright. They purchased these portraits from Wright for the price of $100 apiece, and they were originally hung, I believe, without frames, and the Senate finally passed a resolution ordering frames, and they struck out the word guilt in the resolution and just put up regular painted frames, so they were still trying to save some money probably during the war. Now, the governor's portraits hung in the Senate chamber upstairs in this building, and I believe they were hung between the windows on the second level of the gallery above the main floor. And apparently the place of honor of the reigning sitting governor was to be placed over the main entrance to the Senate chamber. Now, back to these two portraits of Towsey and Seymour, I need to make a slight clarification. The Towsey portrait is the original portrait that was taken down in 1855 and replaced sometime around 1867. I'm not exactly sure. It's never been exactly sure when they went back up. The Seymour portrait, which was removed and put back around the same time, is not the one that we're looking at now. This is the one that's in the collection today. And I discovered as part of the research for this project that the Seymour portrait was completely repainted in 1880 by George Wright again, and he was paid the same fee of $100 16 years after he had painted the original. So in the rest of the presentation, I'm using the Seymour portrait, but it's not the identical portrait that was here in 1855 and in 1861 and removed. Now, to get back to the controversy, if you look at Isaac Towsey's record of public service, both at the local, the state, and the national level, it's quite impressive. And you look at that and you wonder, why would anyone in 1861 want to remove his portrait from the governor's portrait collection? And the problem that he encountered was, as a result of his service as the Secretary of the Navy from 1857 to 1860, he'd been appointed by President James Buchanan and served until early 1860 when the Lincoln administration took over. And Towsey is shown in this photograph seated second from the right. Now, the Buchanan administration was somewhat southern-leaning in its proclivities. They were accused of pandering to the South and not doing enough to forestall the Civil War when they had the chance. Towsey, unfortunately, was part of that administration, and he was kind of tarred with the same brush. But what happened with his tenure as the Secretary of the Navy, in 1858, he sent several squadrons of the Navy to South and Central America. There were several problems that had to be taken care of. So he dispersed the fleet to various places to protect U.S. citizens' interests. And he was accused during the Civil War and just prior to it of deliberately manipulating the Navy so that they would not be available in times of any crisis that was looming on the horizon. He was accused of being a Southern sympathizer and a secessionist and dispersing the Navy so that they wouldn't be around in order to help defend the American coastline in various cities. In 1864, he appeared before a Senate committee, and he explained that the Navy he inherited was ill-equipped, out of date, too small, and he petitioned Congress for funds to improve it, and they were denied. The Panic of 1857 had an impact on that, and funding for the Navy was actually reduced. So there were certain things beyond his control. And he also noted that he had put forward a plan of action in case of war to President Buchanan that he had refused to implement. So the 1864 investigation basically cleared Towsey of all charges, but he was still, throughout the war, still accused of being a Southern sympathizer and of disloyalty to the Union cause during the Civil War. And it was apparently this situation that outraged Senator Platt here in Connecticut and induced him to introduce his resolution to remove the Towsey portrait. Now, as far as Seymour is concerned, he again, if you look at his public service record, incredible dedication to the state and to the United States. He also, in addition to his political career, was a military hero, and he had later served as the minister to Russia from 1853 to 1858. Now, in the Mexican War, Seymour was a major in the Connecticut Volunteers, a major in the 9th United States Infantry, and later served with the United States 12th Infantry. He was known as the hero of Chapultepec for his bravery during the storming of the castle at Chapultepec, which was a major stronghold of the Mexican army, and it blocked the passage and the route to Mexico City. And during the storming of the castle, the commanding officer was severely wounded, and Taussig took command of the unit and eventually was able to storm the castle, take down, I don't know if it was single-handedly, but the Mexican flag was removed and the Stars and Stripes were put up over the castle. They secured the castle and then moved on to take Mexico City, and it was basically the end of the Mexican War. So Seymour had his political career plus his military career under his belt by the time he came back from Russia in 1859, after serving as U.S. minister to Russia for 4 years. Now, one of the groups that met him when he returned in 59 was the Putnam Phalanx. They were a quasi-military group that was organized specifically for this occasion, to welcome the war hero and minister back to Hartford in 1859. By coincidence, the flag that the Phalanx had was also painted by George Frederick Wright. Now, what also greeted former Minister Seymour in Hartford was a resurgent Republican Party. When he left for Russia in 1853, the Republican Party was still kind of in formation. They had not emerged until the late 1850s. They were still going through their kind of know-nothing phase of virulently anti-nativist, anti-immigration. They elected a governor, William T. Minor. One of his first actions was to disband the Irish militia units that were part of the state defense system. So there was an opposition to the immigrants and to especially the Irish in that period. But by 1859, 1860, William Buckingham had been elected governor. The Republicans were pretty much in control of the state legislature and would remain so for about the next 6 or 7 years. On the national level, Seymour was confronted with the resurgence of the national Republican Party, especially with the nomination of Abraham Lincoln as president and Hannibal Hamlin as vice president in the 1860 election. Now, unfortunately for the Democrats, on the national level, they were split into two factions, one led by John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, with more southern leanings, states' rights, and the approval of extending slavery into the newly formed territories. Opposing the Breckinridge faction was that led by Stephen Douglas of Illinois, much more pro-Union, pro-North in his leanings. Now, in the 1860 presidential election in Connecticut, Breckinridge received 16,174 votes and Douglas 17,464. Of course, the split in the Democratic Party meant that the Republicans won the state presidential election. But it's interesting to note that Breckinridge received his highest percentage of votes in Connecticut, and his vote total was nearly as many as the other 4 New England states combined. So there was a strong Breckinridge faction in Connecticut. This is one of the great political cartoons of the period. I think sums up very graphically what was happening to the Democrats in the nation and in Connecticut. You have the Douglas faction on the left, the Breckinridge faction on the right, obviously pulling against each other and about to be totally demolished by the onrushing train being engineered by Abraham Lincoln and Hannibal Hamlin. And then, of course, following Lincoln's election, the southern states began to secede, and the firing on Fort Sumter occurred in early April 1861. Now, the Breckinridge faction in Connecticut became known as Peace Democrats. There were other groups in some other states, mostly in the New England area, but Connecticut's was one of the strongest peace factions in the nation. This is just a brief summary of some of their major tenets. They were called inflexible Jeffersonians or conservative Democrats, favoring agricultural yeomanry over increasing industrialization. They idealized the Southern way of life and supported the South based on family and commercial connections. They demanded a negotiated peace with Confederate states. They were opposed to the war as undermining American principles, and opposed to the coercion of states by the national government. They supported the Dred Scott case for its denial of congressional regulation over slavery in the territories, and they were opposed to emancipation. Now, following his defeat for the governorship in 1860, Thomas Seymour was elected to the Connecticut House of Representatives. And on July 3rd, 1861, he introduced what were known as the Seymour, what have become known as the Seymour Resolutions. And they pretty much sum up the Peace Democrat position. They were in favor of such measures as are best calculated to preserve and maintain the Union unbroken. They looked for a peaceful settlement of the differences now existing. The fugitive slave law ought to be executed in good faith. The rights of the Southern states in regard to slave property should be adjudicated by the Supreme Court. The Missouri Compromise line should be extended to the Pacific, and that resolved that they are utterly opposed to any interference with the institution of slavery in the slaveholding states. Now, the Hartford Courant published a list of the 18 members of the House of Representatives, all Peace Democrats, only Peace Democrats, who voted in favor of the Seymour Resolutions. The Courant said, "We're publishing this list so that they can be remembered." I think if you look at the names of the legislators with their residents, you can see that there was some geographical diversity across the state as to who were holding the democratic principles. A few years after the Civil War ended, the historians Crawford and Morris noted that the Seymour Resolutions received 18 ayes, 173 noes. This was the first platform of the Peace Party, and these 18 represented its political strength. It soon became obvious that this was a part of a concerted effort. It was expected that the Breckinridge Party of the previous fall would form the nucleus of the forces, which is exactly what happened. Now, the Hartford Courant, a Republican paper, stated that Seymour has made himself an object of suspicion and distrust. His legislative career went out in a blaze of infamy. He achieved in one day a political damnation from which there can be no resurrection. On the same day that the Seymour Resolutions were passed, the General Assembly passed an act titled, in addition to an act concerning crimes and punishments. Section 1 said that aiding, abetting, or corresponding with rebels or public enemies was punishable by a fine not exceeding $1,000 and confinement in the state prison for a term not less than 3 to 5 years. Sections 2 to 3 covered the use of Confederate flags being displayed. That was punishable by a fine of not exceeding $100 or by imprisonment in the common jail for a term not exceeding 30 days. And it was also included in this was the provision that such flags or devices so exhibited with the apparatus connected could be seized by the sheriff or the deputy sheriff of the county in which they occurred, and they could be destroyed, just pulled down and destroyed. So the state began taking measures to curb pro-Southern demonstrations as early as July in 1861. Now, the defeat of the Union troops at the Battle of Bull Run in July of 1861 served as a spur to anti-war sentiment in Connecticut, and it proved to be a turning point in the history of that movement. P.T. Barnum recalled that after the defeat of Bull Run, peace meetings began to be held in different parts of the northern states, and especially in Fairfield and Litchfield counties in Connecticut. It was usual in these assemblages to display a white flag bearing the word peace above the national flag and to make and listen to harangues denunciatory of the war. Now, from roughly July to September in 1861, there were peace meetings held in at least 22 locations around the state. Again, there's some geographic spread, a lot of places in Litchfield County, a good number in Hartford, and some in New London and maybe Windham County as well. And Crawford and Morris again recalled, in some places, peace or Confederate flags were raised, but were hauled down and destroyed almost as soon as discovered. It does not appear that the law enacted in July was ever enforced. Now, this is a headline from the Hartford Courant, 24 August of 1861. The article that follows was a fairly graphic description of the outcome of a peace meeting at Stepney, which I believe is near Monroe, Connecticut. Violence in Connecticut. Traitors meeting near Bridgeport. Volunteers attend. Union resolutions passed. The Bridgeport Farmer Office demolished. Contents turned into the street. Immense excitement. Now, what happened was the peace meeting got started. It was interrupted by several wagon loads of recently returned 3-month veterans from the Civil War who had taken offense at the peace meeting and the peace flag. Basically, totally disrupted the meeting. The speakers never got a chance to talk. The flags were torn down and dragged behind the carriages on the way back to Bridgeport. And when they arrived in Bridgeport, they were still fairly stirred up. They attacked the offices of the Bridgeport Farmer, which was a Democratic paper, and totally trashed the office, destroyed the presses, threw the type into the streets, and the owner, the publisher, apparently escaped only by fleeing to the roof of his building and running from rooftop to rooftop until he could get away from the crowd. So that was one of the more, I guess you could say, violent reactions to the peace democratic movement in Connecticut. Again, it was Barnum who spoke about this. He was at the meeting. He had taken his good friend Elias Howe out to the meeting, and he asserted that they were not one of us had any other intention in going to this meeting than to quietly listen to the harangues. But there is some evidence, anecdotal, that perhaps he actually paid for the veteran soldiers to come out to the meeting and do their work. But I haven't been able to pinpoint that. But he said if people were found to be in opposition to the government, it would be best to represent the matter to the government in Washington and ask that measures might be taken to suppress such gatherings. Now, a week after the Stepney meeting, Governor William Buckingham issued this proclamation, which is basically an attempt to suppress dissent. At this critical juncture, our liberties are still further imperiled by the utterance of seditious language, by a traitorous press, by the public exhibition of peace flags, falsely so called, and by an effort to redress grievances regardless of the forms and officers of the law. The very existence of our government, the future prosperity of this entire nation, and the hopes of universal freedom demand that these outrages be suppressed. On October 4th, 1861, a few weeks before the Towsey and Seymour portraits were removed, State Librarian Jeremy Hoadley, in a letter to a friend, noted that peace meetings are stopped in this region now. We've had a small band of secession sympathizers, but to counteract them, there is an association called the Patriots League, having had headquarters in this city and expanding over the state, and treason will not be allowed. Towsey, the late Senate Secretary of the Navy, lives here but keeps very quiet. Many of our prominent citizens will not take any notice of him in the streets, even to bow to him. So this is the political and social context of Platt's resolution to remove the Towsey and Seymour portraits. The reaction to the Platt resolution and the removal of the portraits was fairly steady for the next several months. The Hartford Courant reported that the portraits had been removed from the gilt frames, and a suggestive void now puts the spectator upon inquiry. And the comptroller was to return the portraits whenever he was guaranteed of the loyalty of the ex-governors. Until 1866, the comptroller of the state of Connecticut was Republican, so there's not much chance that that happened before 1867. The Democratic press, represented in Hartford by the Hartford Times, reprinted an article from the Norwich Aurora, another Democratic paper, The action of the Senate in ordering the removal of the portraits, it was purely a partisan transaction, the meanest and most contemptible act that any legislative body ever stooped to. The charges against Tausey had been mentioned only by those who live upon the filth and garbage of party politics. I just gotten the high sign, so I guess I'm running a little late. The Tausey and Seymour were still vilified by the Hartford Courant well through October of 1861. Seymour apparently was unfazed by the removal of his portrait. He continued his statements against the war, continued to be vilified in the local press. There is some evidence that the portraits were returned in 1862, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was Seymour's continued statements against the war that resulted in them being removed again, and the Courant said probably never to be replaced. Sorry to have to speed up, but in 1863 there were 3 resolutions to restore the portraits to the Senate chamber. However, none of them had any chance of passing in the Republican legislature. March 1863, Seymour continues his anti-war statements while he was running for the governorship again in 1863. He said he doubted if the Union can be restored at all. In the election between Seymour and Buckingham, Seymour was defeated by only 2,600 votes, and apparently the margin of victory was provided by 3,000 votes cast by Connecticut soldiers who were furloughed back to Connecticut in order to vote for Governor Buckingham. As late as 1865, even after the war ended, there were still comments in the press about the portraits. They were apparently replaced again in 1865, but were taken back down over strong objections being made to them being put back. And the Albany Evening Journal, reprinted in the Hartford Courant in May of '65, said that they were returned, but after the honorable members had looked at them about 6 hours, they became sick of the sight and the pictures were taken down. And again in '65, P.T. Barnum, who was a member of the legislature, sauntered into the Senate chamber, saw the empty frames, wondered what was going on. It was explained to him that they were ex-governors whose position on political affairs was obnoxious to the dominant party, thus proving, it would seem, that there is an intimate connection between politics and art. Now, we know that, I have to say, I'm not exactly sure what happened to the portraits after 1861. Tausey was replaced, Seymour was repainted, but what happened to them in between those years, I have absolutely no idea. I've not been able to track that down. But they were both back in the state library at the new state capitol by the 1880s, well into the 1900s. Seymour and Tausey are the third and fourth in from the right-hand side in this photograph. Now, as late as 1903, Orville Platt, who introduced the resolution, didn't seem to be absolutely sure if it was Seymour's portrait that was removed, and he made no mention of the Tausey portrait in his recollections. In 1910, the portraits were moved to Memorial Hall at the Connecticut State Library, where they remain, and Sally, that's where they will remain, I'm sorry to tell you. Now, Tausey and Seymour aren't completely forgotten. Tausey's memorial in Cedar Hill Cemetery, as well as the Seymour Monument, also in Cedar Hill, they are included on the cemetery's Surveying the 19th Century Political Landscape tour, so they can be seen, but the little blurbs about Seymour and Tausey make no reference to the, shall we call, the late unpleasantness that surrounded them in 1861. So I guess my time is about up, if not completely over, so I thank you for your attention and look forward to your comments and questions later.
Thank you, Dave. That was great. While our guests get mic'd for the panel part of the discussion, I would just like to let you know that you have programs that tell you of our upcoming programs. We have a spooky Halloween program coming up on October 28th. But we also have another program coming up on November 9th where Matt Warschauer will speak about Soldier's Heart, or PTSD, during the Civil War, and we will have a panel discussion following that. And I would also like to invite you, after the panel today, if you have time, you can run upstairs and take a look at the Senate, where those paintings originally hung, and where I hope one day, despite Dave's protests, they will hang again. But I would invite you all to take a look at that. And if you come back for a tour someday, you can hear the story about how a portrait of Abraham Lincoln was kept out of the old State House by people who disagreed with him. And now I believe I can pass this on to Diane.
Thank you, Sally. It's always interesting for me to hear discussions about Connecticut's history as seen through the eyes of what was reported in the Hartford Courant, particularly since, although some people may not agree, we have a tradition now in our newspapers of trying to be objective. That wasn't always the case. Newspapers were very much on one side or another of major issues, as we've learned in our discussion of the Civil War. And we have Carolyn Lumsden with us today, who's the director of the opinion pages for the Hartford Courant. And I wonder what you think when you see our history reflected in the kinds of statements that Dave showed us, that where the paper really was making a strong condemnation of what had happened.
Vigorous debate. Love it. Hi, I'm Carolyn from the Courant, and I was just saying that we love vigorous debate. We try to get it on both sides now, but the more debate, the better.
Thank you. We're glad you're here. Very interesting to have this panel with us. Dave Corrigan, of course, you've already met. Seated next to him is Martha McCoy. Martha is the Executive Director of Everyday Democracy and President of the Paul J. Eicher Foundation. Martha has been working for 20 years at the intersection of deliberative democracy, community problem solving, and racial justice. Under her leadership, Everyday Democracy has become known as a national organization that helps local community groups involve all kinds of people in working together to solve political problems and public problems. The organization works with local, regional, and national organizations to connect public dialogue to community change. Martha is the co-chair with the Secretary of the State, Denise Merrill, of the Connecticut Civic Health Advisory Group, which is going to issue a report next week on Connecticut's Civic Health Index. We'll get into that in a minute. And I also want to introduce someone who, as everyone always says, really needs no introduction, but indulge me anyway. Joining our panel is someone who has been part of the conversation of Connecticut for about 50 years now, Brad Davis. And of course, Brad is known very well for his community involvement. Brad was among the first to really rally support for veterans, for the homeless, the hungry, and he devotes countless hours giving back to the community. Brad made his debut on WTIC Channel 3 TV on September 28, 1958. The Brad Davis Show ran until 1969. In 69, Brad teamed up with John Sablon for What's Happening, an investigative news program. That show ran until 1977, when Brad moved to WDRC Radio, where he has been doing the morning program on AM 1360 for 31 years. So please welcome Brad and Martha and Dave to our program today. Dave, I'm going to start with you. You mentioned during your talk that Governor Buckingham issued a proclamation urging citizens to support the state government and refrain from unpatriotic activities. How would the governor have defined unpatriotic, and is it similar to the charges that we hear today when someone is labeled unpatriotic?
I think it's similar. I think at the time the union cause was not a foregone conclusion. And I think most people would have agreed, a lot of people would have agreed at the time, that anyone who said anything against that or questioning that, questioning the motives of President Lincoln or the federal government should be considered unpatriotic. Mm-hmm. I think it had a very good effect on dissent in Connecticut, because shortly thereafter the peace meetings just simply stopped. Mm-hmm. P.T. Barnum mentions that this is what happened as a result of these various things that were done by the state. I think there's a certain similarity between what would be unpatriotic then as now. I think those in power always consider those criticizing them to some extent unpatriotic. But I think it depends on your viewpoint what you believe to be patriotic. And I think that has changed a little bit over time.
Martha, I think that I'm always put off when I hear people label someone with a dissenting opinion as unpatriotic because, and maybe this is a naive interpretation, but to me, in a country that guarantees freedom of expression, you have the right to discuss your view, whether it is in accord with the government or not.
Yes.
So how can that be unpatriotic?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that gets to the nub of something that we're seeing today when that kind of discourse is happening because, as some people have pointed out, it's a way not just of questioning someone's views, but of actually disparaging their motives and intentions. And it really is basically saying, you're not worth listening to. And I think anytime we get into that kind of name-calling or judgments about somebody's motives in a democracy, then we get into trouble because, by definition, why would you work with someone like that? Why would you even try to figure things out? I was struck when you were talking, though, David, that this is such an interesting time period to be looking at. I mean, this is really just 7 generations ago that we're talking about. I was figuring that out while I was sitting there. And, people were fighting to keep the Union together. And so whatever we're facing today, and I think we're facing a lot of issues that have trickled down from that time period where a lot of things were not necessarily resolved by the Civil War, we are still, that was a really different kind of time period. And so I kept trying to put myself into that frame, and it's an interesting one to put yourself in.
Brad, you have been participating in the conversation in Connecticut on all topics now for several decades. How has that conversation and the public dialogue, if you will, changed in what you see every day on your radio program?
Well, let me just say to you that it has changed dramatically in the last year. I am on 4 radio stations throughout the state, in different cities and towns. And it was much calmer. But I fault also radio talk show hosts who encourage this. And they do it for so-called show business reasons, but to get people so they are really, really violent. And I ran across a couple of them in the last year, so from now on, they are not allowed on my program. I don't care if we live in a democracy or not. I run the program. And if they don't behave civilly, I don't mean you can't, disagree with the president or agree with him or whatever. I don't agree with his issues. However, he's still the president of the United States, no matter who it is. And that's the respect you have for the office. And I am not going to put up with some of the things that come over the airways, and some of my brothers and sisters encourage that. I don't.
Brad, when you mentioned that things have really changed over the last year or so, what do you take that back to? If you saw a point when this really started turning, what would you say the point was?
Well, I think it's turned tremendously since the current president was elected. Mm-hmm. And the more it goes, the more it is changing. I mean, I have never, ever seen anything like it. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, comes this Herman Cain. And people are starting to listen to him. But I tell my audience that it's a long way to go, and don't sell President Obama short. Mm-hmm. He has got a great youth following. 25% of the elderly that supported the last Republican are dead. They're gone. They're gone. And the young people are coming on really, really strong, and they are not so concerned about the issues as they are concerned about themselves. And again, they tend to like the president. So I'm not counting him out. I think it's going to be very difficult. If the election were held today, he would be absolutely defeated, no question about it. But you've still got a long time, and a lot of things can change.
Martha, let's talk a little bit about this report that's coming out next week. It's been called the Civic Health Index of Connecticut. Put that in layman's terms. What does that mean exactly?
Sure. what we did when we teamed up with the Secretary of the State's office and the National Conference on Citizenship is that we decided that it was a good time to sort of look at the overall way in which the state is doing in terms of how do we relate to each other as members of the public. When we're in the public sphere, not in our family lives or home lives or not in our work lives, but really in our community settings where we do volunteering, sometimes voting as citizens, where we get together to solve public problems. What does that look like in terms of the health? And we know from of that kind of life. And we know from what people have looked at that civic health, meaning that people are crossing divisions to work with each other, that they are listening to each other, that they are working on public problems together, that they're getting out there to meet with each other across those kinds of divides, and voting and volunteering. That kind of health in a state and in a nation is really related to other kinds of health, like economic health, or other things we really care about, like reducing disparities in education and in health care and in economic opportunity and in housing. Those kinds of things are directly related to our civic health, and so we thought that it was important as a state to take a look at that and see how are we doing and where could we improve, because that will make us a better state to live in, it'll make us a stronger democracy, and it'll make us stronger on all sets of indicators.
Brad, as I was listening to Dave talk about what was happening as the Civil War was getting underway and the charges of people being unpatriotic, it reminded me of the debate that went on in this country in the run-up to the war in Iraq, and how many politicians felt they had to go along with it regardless of what they really thought or deep in their hearts felt was right, because if you didn't go along with it and you didn't support the president, you were labeled unpatriotic and you couldn't be in that position. In fact, even some newspapers, the New York Times recently said that they should have taken a harder look at it. They've said that they didn't use this word, but in a sense intimidated into going along with the whole thing. Is that what you found with your listeners at the time? Did you feel that if someone wanted to dissent with the idea of going to Iraq or the war effort, that they weren't allowed to speak?
You know, looking at the war now, there was nobody that was more, being a former Marine, gung-ho than going into Iraq. And I was the same with Afghanistan. But then I started, all of a sudden, getting calls. And I have got so many now that I made the statement not so long ago, it's time for us to get out of it all, because we can't win it, and there's no way that we can win it, and the time to bring the boys home. And my audience all of a sudden said the same thing. So it went from here, let's go in, let's get them, and now let's bring them home. It's time to bring them home and not lose any more.
Do you think if people had been able to discuss it more freely at the time, or maybe you disagree with me, maybe people did discuss it freely. My sense was that politicians were put in a position of having to go along with it, or they would be labeled almost as the enemy, not willing to fight the war against terrorism. If there'd been a more full debate, maybe we wouldn't have gone in?
That's a good point. And I truly believe now, as I look back and I listen to my audience, that we could have taken some more time. Yes, absolutely.
Martha, I think also about, what's happened in the last few years with the emergence of the Tea Party, and now the protesters I mentioned in the very beginning of this program today, the Occupy Wall Street people, Occupy Hartford, all the various cities, that people take time to dissent, but they're looked at in different ways. The left looks at the Tea Party in one way, the right perhaps looks at the Occupy people in another way. What about just the idea of free flow of ideas and allowing and even encouraging dissent?
Right, and I think that's a really important point, and I think that gets at what is really a systemic problem in our democracy. We don't have in our democracy opportunities that are regular ways for people from different views to sit down together, to listen to each other, to hash things out and talk about them, and then to work together with government to make sure that those things that they come up with are carried out. And so absent those kinds of opportunities, and dissent is a wonderful thing and it's an important thing that we need to value, but there's still a lot of people who are sort of sitting back feeling like they're on the sidelines and they don't know how to plug in. And I think that we need to be thinking about ways that people can actually have those kinds of opportunities, because that is really where it's going to happen. So for example, during the lead up to the Iraq War, there was a person who held public conversations around the country, a very respected outfit out of Stanford University, Center for Deliberative Democracy. They held discussions among regular folks from diverse backgrounds, and what they came up to is, let's wait, this isn't a good time to go in. But we don't have a democracy where we're actually tapping into people's voice in a very authentic way, and the power of money in politics is so great that money speaks more loudly than any kind of absent citizen assembly that we have.
You know, my favorite president was Ronald Reagan, and I always remember the story that Reagan told when he was having problem getting his tax cut through Congress. He was a good friend with Tip O'Neill, and there was no bigger liberal in the House than Tip O'Neill, and he was Speaker. And they were about ready to vote on the tax bill, and every now and then the president would get together with Tip and they'd go out and have a little drink together, being two Irishmen. And so the vote was coming around noontime. And the president called up Tip O'Neill. He says, Tip, I want to ask you a favor. Can you make believe it's 6 o'clock? And they passed the tax bill. Tip O'Neill just broke up. Couldn't believe it. Reagan said, just believe it's 6 o'clock, Tip. That's too bad we don't have that today.
It's a great story, Brett. And that is part of what has led to the kind of discourse that we have now, is that we don't have people who are willing to reach across the aisle. I want to open up this conversation to everybody in the audience. If anyone has a question or a comment to make, please raise your hand and I'll be happy to call on you. Just briefly, I wanted to point out Matt Warschauer is here, professor at Connecticut State University and also the chairman of the Civil War Commission, the Commemoration Commission. And Matt, it strikes me that you talk to your students in class today about dissent and protest, things that are interesting them, and show them this was going on and it was being squelched in the years leading up to the war.
I'm actually right now teaching a political history class to juniors and seniors that runs from 1776 to 1876, and we're reading every single presidential inaugural address from Washington to Rutherford B. Hayes. And the students, I think what they're learning most is the similarities between levels of dissent and the issues that are being raised between then and now, and how little the political system changes. And, you know, I started with the beginning of the semester and said to the students, you know, I'm not sure I have any answers for you about how to solve this problem, but as you are going to be our next generation of leaders for the nation, you've got to start thinking outside of the box now. Learn this history so we can try and avoid it. And, you know, I would like to mirror what Ray said in that, you know, I've been studying the history of politics, especially the Civil War, for a long time now. I've never understood the mean-spiritedness of partisanship and of throwing out ideology and focusing on just pure power. In the Civil War period, I've never understood it better than right now, because I can see it in my midst. And I've got some, I think, very reasonable worries about what may be headed our way.
Does anybody else have concerns about that, and what are we doing to address it?
Just a comment on where we are today, where we came from. I'm the old generation, and I think back of how people worked with people, helping each other without any need from other, government or anyone else. It was a matter of taking care of your neighbor when it was an issue, and I don't see that today. I think today it is too many people. Maybe we're part of the problem in bringing up the next generation, but too many people looking for a handout, looking for something really for nothing. I mean, they think they deserve it because of the fact they live in a government that, has all kinds of, I call them gifts or freedoms. and they are abused to me currently, to the point where they don't seem to know that they are being abused. They think it's an obligation of what they're doing. At the same time, she mentioned before, there isn't really a way where they could sit and discuss this and resolve it, other than maybe doing what they're doing. But I just see that as a major change in where we are from where my generation came from. We had many, we were a bigger family, and my dad would farm us out. You go over and help this one, you go do that one. And it was never a case where people looked for something, as though it were a gift to them. It was always an appreciated help. So it's just a comment that I make.
It's very interesting that you bring that up, because one of the things that this report on the civic health of Connecticut is going to show, and I don't want to release all the results because it's coming out next week, but one of the things that it has shown is that there is a lack in Connecticut of neighbors being connected to neighbors, exactly what you talked about, right, Martha?
Yeah, exactly. And it also shows some good news, is that people are wanting to, it seems that people are wanting to work with others on solving public problems. So I think that's really related too. So it might get to some of the neighbor to neighbor stuff. And interestingly too, just to give another headline from the report, because of the history of the state and sort of and actually nationwide, but also in Connecticut, the growing gap in income and wealth, there are differing levels of opportunities for participation that often fall along income lines and also racial and ethnic lines. So I think that once we take a look at this whole kind of mix and we say, what's the part for individual responsibility, reaching out, because I think that's got to be a part of it. What's the part for the kind of structures that need to support the way people look at some of these disparities that are really hitting our state in terms of the quality of life for all of us? How can we deal with those in an honest, passionate way, but also civil at the same time?
I also truly believe that our friends in the African American community have really say what they feel. They're honest. They know what they want. And I see it in their churches. I go to the First Cathedral quite often in Bloomfield, the largest African American church in New England. And it is, they know how to dress. They know how to dress for church. I go to my church sometimes and you think you just got through mowing the lawn.
Well,
that's important.
It's interesting that you say that, Brad, because one of the things this report shows is that African Americans are much more active in their communities through their churches.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Brad, I was interested in what you thought about the idea that, on your radio program you can offer an opportunity for a forum, but it's really not a place where you can come to solutions. So I guess then the question for all of us is, where do we go to find solutions? It's one thing to vent about the problems, to call your show or anywhere else and say, I disagree with this, blah, blah, blah. But then how do we work on fixing that? How do you get the next step? And that's really, where do you take it from the discussion to the action plan?
Good question.
I know you're very involved in community organizations. Do you see organizations that are actually encouraging that kind of discussion and getting people together to try to solve problems on a local level?
Oh, I do. Yes, we're just about ready to start one. We call it Turkey Tuesday. And you have no idea where we're at right now. We have a lot of people, middle-class people, that don't have work, and we'll do it. We've got to raise 20,000 turkeys this year between the 15th of November and Thanksgiving, and we'll do it.
Brad's talking about a program that feeds people on Thanksgiving, people who would not be able to have a Thanksgiving dinner except for the kindness of others who are willing to be involved. Does anybody else have a question they'd like to ask to the panel or a point to make? Yes?
It isn't a question so much, but it's more observation from the historian from the Connecticut Historical Society. The two cartoons with the two parties in the cart, they pulled apart, and the other one was the peace meeting, how similar they are to today, whereas the two House and the Congress in our system, they're not working together. They're in their little corners and they're doing their own thing. They're not observing what the people want, and they're doing their own thing to have a safe haven so they have, to be reelected. And then the peace meeting, how the Occupy Wall Street or all over the world now is showing that the people are out there peacefully talking about their issues, and some renegade people will come in with violence and try to disrupt and create havoc. So it mirrors today as well. I thought those are my observations of those two.
What's the general sense from the people who are here about the Occupy Hartford, Occupy Wall Street movement, on whether it's gaining ground, whether it's legitimate? Early on, several weeks ago, we heard at least one of the political candidates, one of our elected officials in Congress calling the people a mob. Are they a mob, or are they people who are really trying to affect change and looking for a way to affect change? Yes.
My observation is basically, to me it's kind of very odd just to see how one side is against the other. When the Tea Party started, the Democrats called them all kinds of names. Most of the media called them all types of names. And now with the Occupy Wall Street, and I'll just say, Nancy Pelosi had called the Tea Party all these negative names, and now she comes out and she's supporting the occupiers, which is only to show you what's going on in Washington. And to me, it comes right from the White House to both houses that's causing a lot of our problems. Because when I looked over the past years, this is the first administration that I see so negatively talk about the other party. And to me, that should not happen coming from the White House. That's just my observation.
One of the things that people have said is that the reason civil discourse has become so uncivil is because people don't seem to be willing to cross the aisle and work with each other. But maybe that's just what's going on in Washington. Maybe that's not the case here in our own community in Connecticut. Val is one of the authors of the Civic Health Report. Val, what do you see on the grassroots level where people in all sorts of communities get together to try to solve problems? Is there that same sort of fight over ideology?
Well, I think that one of the things that is most important is that you really have to work at getting people together who are from different points of view. It's not an easy proposition. And one of the things that everyday democracy does is precisely try to make sure that when we work with communities that we have different points of views represented in the dialogue. And it's not easy. It takes working with different groups, with coalitions, to engage those individuals, because for the most part they will tend to think, oh, well, this is another conversation by the left, so I don't want to be a part of it. And what we have to do is tell them, this is a space where there's going to be civil, respectful dialogue on problems that are impacting everybody. So it takes a lot of work, and that's not typically the easiest thing to do. And I don't think in this country sometimes the easiest way out hasn't been the one way to follow.
Dave, that sounds like Val is looking for sort of what's been called a kumbaya moment. In all of your knowledge about the history of Connecticut state politics, have there been those moments, and is there likely to be one coming up?
I'm not sure there have been. I know one other instance where the attempt to stifle dissent or dissenting opinions occurred during or after the building of the State Armory at Broad and Capitol Avenue. It was built there specifically because of the fears of manufacturers and the government officials about a labor uprising in all the factories that once occurred out Capitol Avenue. They heard about the labor unrest in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, and it comes out in the testimony in the hearings about the location of the armory. The fact that it was being built was never an issue. It was just a question of where. And it was specifically placed between the Capitol and the insurance companies to stem any overflow that they feared was going to happen in the factories by the mostly unskilled workers that had emigrated in the 1880s. It never really happened in Hartford. There was a major strike in 1901. It was a nationwide strike by the Machinists Union, but nothing ever really took place. There was ultimately no need for that armory right there based on what they thought was going to happen. I think I'd love to see a kumbaya moment in Connecticut. I think that might maybe that would start a new land of steady habits. If we could do that more frequently, you know, we'd have a new steady habit to work with.
Yeah.
Martha, I'm going to let you and Brad have the last word.
Okay, actually, I
why
was
don't
going
you
to
start?
say why it's not quite kumbaya is when you get into the middle of those conversations, there's productive conflict. So I think that's the difference between the incivility we see where people are sort of attacking each other personally and getting down there and really having conflict but using it well. And I think that's where the real tough work of democratic conversation happens. And I'm thinking of in Stratford, for example, where the mayor's office and community groups pulled people together because there had been a police shooting of a young African-American man, and there was a lot of tension in the community. And they had some very tough long-term and are still having conversations about what does a fair police department look like, what does an inclusive teaching pool look like in the school system, how can we create racial equity in our community. So I say, yes, it's happening, and it takes, as Val said, a lot of hard work, but if we can do that all over the state, and it's happening all over the country, but it's flying under the radar because the way the media are structured right now is we're focused on the conflict, we're focused on the mudslinging, and that's kind of trying to convince us that we can't work with each other, but underneath that there's a lot of stuff going on.
Brad, you have the last word.
One thing I want to leave you with, and I see it more and more every day. The Republicans will never, and I said a Ronald Reagan conservative, fiscally, but the Republicans will never win this election unless the Tea Party gets together with the rank and file. They are separated, and this is going to kill them in this election unless they, for example, Romney right now is really the leader. Herman Cain is making a charge, but they don't like Romney. They don't like Romney, and they won't vote for Romney. And that is what this group of people has to change. And that's why I say it's not the R's and the D's anymore. It's all of us together, both sides, coming up with a solution, and we can.
Brad, thank you so much. Brad Davis, Martha McCoy, Dave Corrigan, thank you to all of you for being here. I want to invite you to come back on November 14th. We're going to be having a town hall meeting where we'll be discussing these issues in a little bit more detail. We'll be going into the details of the report on Connecticut's civil health, its connectedness in communities, its challenges that we face, and how we solve problems without government always having to be the answer. We'd love you to be part of that conversation. And if you can't be here that evening at 6 o'clock, then we'd love you to tune in and see it on CTN. So thank you so much for joining us today at the Old State House.
Thanks very much. Again, I invite you to go up and take a look at the Senate, to stay and chat with each other, and to fill out your surveys. And thank you again for coming.